It's a pretty good.
Class wouldn't be fun if I didn't
How long that will hold up there, but it's running. So, greetings. This evening we're going to focus on St. Augustine, but I have to kind of lay the groundwork for why he's so significant. How many of you have heard of St. Augustine before? Some?
Florida?
Florida? Yes. It's clearly one of, there are actual multiple St. Augustines besides towns. St. Augustine is a beautiful little town with a nice little college.
Is it South Carolina or is it Florida? Is it
Florida.
Okay,
Florida.
I thought it was Prince George.
I don't know if there's one in other places. I mean, it was kind of funny discovering that there is no Moscow in Russia. There is a Moscow in Pennsylvania, I think, and I think Ohio. There's Moscows in the United States. But in Russia, the capital city is Moskva, which is not Moscow. They don't even have a W in their alphabet. So that's just kind of fun. I remember meeting the ambassador from Finland to East Germany when I was stationed in Berlin. I was a Mason. I'm still a Mason, actually, a Freemason. And we had a open house kind of thing. And he was one of the attendees, and so I got to meet him. And out of curiosity, I said to him, "What is the name for Finland in Finland?" Because I had come to realize that most countries aren't what we call them in English, and Finland certainly doesn't sound like something they would call themselves. And he looked at me puzzled, like, "Why would you ask that?" But he answered, "Suomi." Whoa.
Oh.
That's totally different than Finland. It's not like Finlandia or something of that sort. Suomi. But so St. Augustine, the one we're looking at is this one. By the way, if any of you need it, there's the password for the Wi-Fi here. I'll leave that up just in case more folks come. But St. Augustine, I've heard it pronounced Augustine, and we want the one who's famously the Bishop of Hippo. I'll just go to Wikipedia. Obviously, any pictures or paintings you see of him are just a guess by people that probably are thinking in terms of their own culture and day, and not necessarily anything pretense associated with the actual. By the way, some people think because he was in North Africa that he might have been of black descent. So sometimes you'll see pictures of him painted as a black saint, which is probably also just a guess. His parents were members of a Roman colony in North Africa, so probably, who knows, right? More Roman, because we don't really know what the Romans looked like back then. If you see contemporary Romans, of course, they're not necessarily related. Who knows? I think I've heard Sicilians are considered more closely related to the ancient Romans, but I don't. DNA tests should answer all of that eventually, I suppose, if anybody wants to do it. But so St. Augustine of Hippo, we know a lot about him because of all his writings, and also he made a movie. I think I even shared it with you last week, didn't I? If you decided to watch it, you could just look up St. Augustine, der Film, right? Movie. this is if you. This particular copy has Arabic subtitles. That's not because it was an Arabic movie or anything. It's a European movie, but whoever stole it from put it on the internet, they gave it.
I had an appointment.
An appointment? With who?
Every year on this day, I come up here at dawn, and I watch the storms migrate.
If only we could fly away.
So there's even a movie about him that's kind of and it's a good one, by the way, and perhaps accurate actually, although who knows. One questionable part of it, I was surprised at was during his time as the main rhetor for the emperor in Milan, for the Roman emperor. He was, I mean, we know he was the chosen orator, the mouthpiece, so to speak, the White House spokesperson, right, for the emperor. And during that time, there was a conflict between the emperor and Bishop Ambrose, who was really the head of the church at the time in Milan. And Bishop Ambrose won the conflict, but it almost came to the soldiers attacking the unprotected people in the church, because the emperor wanted the basilica, but the bishop wouldn't give it up. And the conflict was mostly because the emperor was a follower of the Arian heresy, which we call it today, different version of Christianity, and Ambrose was a follower of Athanasius, which is the actual Orthodox view still today of the Catholic Church. Right? And the movie depicts St. Augustine as being on the emperor's side at that time. But one of the biographies I've read of him argues that he must have been actually on Ambrose's side at the time, especially because his mother was in the church at the time of the conflict. But so, I don't know that anyone actually knows for sure. I mean, he's got his own biography, his confessions, but in that, he doesn't really make it clear, as far as I can tell, which side he's on. So I suppose you could take either position. But that was pretty interesting. I've also heard two versions of his death. The one version is that when the Visigoths attacked Hippo, that was when he was killed. But another contemporary lecturer said that he died in his 70s, surrounded by his friends. So there are questionable aspects of his biography. But we do know an awful lot about him because of the amount of things he wrote. So if we go and look at wait a minute, I got my own links mixed up. Oh, sorry. One of these is the one I want. Okay. So this particular site has, I think, just about all of his works. And if we go up, I think this takes us up. And I guess we can go up further. Which way can we go? Oh, I guess that's not going to help. Perhaps we could just go like this. they have all of his works there. I guess you have to go in through the main door and then go look at them, I guess. There must be a way that you could go and look at them individually. But we'll look at this somewhat as we go tonight, especially looking at one of the chapters. Notice in this particular arrangement that each chapter is roughly about a page of text. So it looks like it is a really long book, but it's not as long as it looks when you're looking at the table of contents and you see all these chapters and then book 2, etc. It's not that long. But he's written an incredible amount of work. In fact, they argue that not all of it has been translated, maybe not all of it has been found. Occasionally they still find some more of his work squirreled away in a monastery someplace in Europe. And a lot of that was, of course, they weren't publishing actual books at the time, right? That's not really going to start until the Gutenberg press, roughly around the same time as the Reformation and Martin Luther and so on, right? But you're looking at handwritten, usually on papyrus or on lambskin texts, which then are handwritten and passed on. And a lot of his letters that we have, like for example, to the Saint Jerome, who was the translator of the New and the Bible, the Old and New Testament, the Old Testament from Hebrew and the New Testament from Greek, right? By the way, I read a thing that said that most people don't even know what language the New Testament was written in. Just to make sure you know, it was written in what's called Koine Greek, or the common Greek. So it wasn't even educated Greek, it was the Greek of kind of the common or the vulgar tongue. Vulgar doesn't mean it's bad, right?
The commoners?
The commoners, yes, yes. The Vulgate, for example, is the Latin translation, which means the language that is kind of a common speech. But the letters he wrote to Saint Jerome Saint Jerome was in like Palestine or Syria or somewhere around there, and so from Africa through the Roman Empire over to where Saint Jerome was, they were transmitted through lots of hands, and virtually everyone that got a hold of the letter would take it and first copy it and make other copies for their friends. So by the time St. Jerome got the letter from St. Augustine, everybody that was interested already knew what St. Augustine had said. And then by the time the letter from St. Jerome would come back, everyone that was interested would know what St. Jerome had said in response, back and forth. And that's true of the other letters as well. And so, of course, there are letters, copies of letters that ended up getting squirreled away, and then who knows who gets these copies. And the same thing with regard to the books, the so-called books. They would be passed by copyists, right? So you're probably not able to imagine a absolutely clear set of works that you could go to the library and find sitting on the shelf. Although, if you do, you'll find lots, of course. But the Confessions is interesting because it's his actual autobiography of himself. Notice his dates here. So 354. So he's considered one of the post-Nicene fathers, right? Not one of the anti-Nicene fathers. In other words, the Nicene Council has already met and basically come to an agreement on what a Christian has to believe. Yes? We talked about that last week, I think, right? Okay. And the main issue that the council was concerned with was Move this a little further. Am I boring anyone, or is this okay? No one's... So, when you get right down to it, the problem is who this person was. Yes? In fact, that's a Latinized version of the name. If you saw the movie The Passion, according to Mel Gibson, no one laughed. Gosh, that could have been such a funny, right? Yes, Mel Gibson? Yes, you got, yeah. That is actually a funny joke. If you speak Hebrew, Mel is a joke, actually, about, but that's okay. No one gets it. That's all right. Remember the word El is Hebrew for God, right? So if you look at all the names like Rachel, Mike L, Ariel, etc., those are all, they all have meaning, you know, shield of God, you know, sword of God, you know, pain in the ass of God, you know, whatever the name might mean. Sorry about that. That's terrible. That might have been your name. I'm sorry. No. You know, you could go look that one up. Actually, you can if you have curiosity about one of those names that end in L. You could just go on lots of sites that ask, you know, what's the Hebrew meaning of that name, and it gives you, well, actually the English version of whatever it might mean. But in that movie, they referred to Jesus as Yeshua, which would be perhaps the correct translation in what language? I remember Pilate referring to him as Yeshua, and the question, of course, is, well, was Pilate speaking Latin, or was Pilate speaking Greek, or Aramaic? Well, probably not. But Pilate, who was the Roman head of the government appointed by Augustus, would have been the head in Jerusalem and other places. Remember, King Herod was actually appointed as well as the head of Judea, right? So there's a separate kingdom there, which, by the way, comes up in the trial of Jesus, because they send him back and forth to Pilate, to Herod. You know, they keep passing him around according to the stories, right? Because no one wants to deal with them, apparently, right? Yes? Is this news to anyone? I don't know where your background. So we'll call him Jesus. And the problem is, according to the official tradition, Jesus happens to be God. Yes? You've all heard that? Okay. So the question then is Jesus man, and just man only, or is he God, or is he both? However you want to symbolize that. Right? And if you took this side, you're a follower of Arius, and if you took this side, you're just wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And if you took this side, you're a follower of Athanasius, which I might not have spelled correctly.
Wrong.
Yeah, you're just wrong if you think he's just a man, right? You know, because that's fire for you. You know, the steak kind of, or kind of, they do still chop off heads. In fact, I've seen an interview with the executioner, and he's got two different kinds of swords: the kind for going this way, and the kind for going this way. That's Saudi Arabia, but if you're curious, go onto YouTube and look up the executioner from Saudi Arabia interview, and you'll find it and it's pretty gruesome, etc. He's already grooming his young son to take his job once he's too old and retires from this profession. You know, so that's kind of interesting cultural aspect of life in Saudi Arabia. Yeah, so you're just wrong if you think he's a man. But there are, of course, folks still today that will take this point of view. One, for example, would be Robert Funk. And one of his books is Honest to Jesus. And he basically argues that Jesus was a significant teacher, had some great insights, and was very popular, but his teachings were transformed into religion. And what we need to do is to be honest to Jesus, is prune all of the religion ideas and get rid of those and get back to be honest to Jesus, who's just a man with some nice ideas. You know, love your neighbor as yourself and things of that sort. So he's an example. By the way, Robert Funk is a main member of the Jesus Seminar, and there's about 700 members of the seminar. A lot of them, like Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crowson, these are all, I don't know that Shelby Spong is part of it, but they meet every 4 years and have a conference and talk about their most recent studies and conclusions and so on. A very active, continuing subject, the field, trying to do Jesus studies and so on. And a lot of it is focused from a couple hundred years ago, when there were essentially the results of the Reformation, which that's Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Knox, lots of others, of course, that both basically broke away from the Orthodox Church and established not only separate churches, not on purpose maybe, but started separate churches like the Lutheran Church and so on. But in doing that, they opened up the possibility of everybody researching Jesus for themselves, instead of having to just listen to what the church said, right? So the bishops would basically, of course, tell you what you should believe, and they're not interested in your point of view, right? Theoretically, right? But once you have the Reformation, Martin Luther famously thought that he was a much better guide to who Jesus was, and wanted everyone to read the Bible for themselves, and so on. Then got very upset when people started disagreeing with him. So he ended up getting furious and basically suggesting that let God kill them all, or kill them all and let God sort them out, you know, into which you know, that's a kind of a famous quote, right? Notice they had a terrible series of religious wars in Europe as a result of the Reformation, and different nation states took sides, so that sort of, you know, it became a political issue, not just a matter of belief. But once that happened, and the Bible was available through the Gutenberg press, so now everyone with a certain amount of money at least could have their own copy. And then there was a translation effort. So you had Martin Luther translating it into German, and others translating it into other languages. Of course, King James becomes, I guess, the most popular one in England. So you have translation, so everyone can start reading the text for themselves. Now, they are reading it in translation usually, right? So that means you're dependent on the way the translators interpreted things. And the way there's still translations of that. I was reading a brand new translation relatively a couple of years, and that's by this one is by David Bentley Hart, which, as you can see, just came out in 2017. So that's still an active subject for lots of folks. And this, by the way, I found at least interesting. One of the puzzles I've always had was when the Magi, right, the wise men from the East, you know, the Magi are Persians, magicians, basically, and they see his star in the east, and they followed it to Bethlehem. And that always puzzled me because Persia is farther east than Bethlehem, so if they saw the star in the east, they went the wrong way to get to Bethlehem, right? Well, this guy translated that very phrase by saying, "We saw your star arising." Doesn't put it in the east, right? It's still a puzzlement how you would actually follow a star that's perhaps a comet or something of that sort. Since the only one I know people generally follow is the North Star, the polar, Polaris, right? Because that's always in the same place, right? So it's a good guide for a direction. But in any case, he fixed that puzzle, and so that was kind of interesting. So that's interesting, all this stuff. But the conflict in the Nicene Council that was called by Constantine the Great was to settle the conflict among Christians, right? So you've got this council, the first one, called, and there's lots of stuff known about it. They kept records and so on. And the main conflict was between these 2 points of view. And as a result of the conflict, Arianism, following Arius, was condemned as heresy. And as a result, all of the books associated with the Arian heresy had to be destroyed. Well, of course they weren't. A lot of them were buried someplace. And by the way, recently discovered, and I'll mention one of them, the Book of Thomas is available. And that's referred to as a Gnostic gospel because Arius's followers were considered Gnostics, which means that you have special knowledge of God because of a specific passing on of hands that they had that you couldn't just learn unless you were also in the church itself. Right? Athanasius argues that Jesus is both man and God. And the end result is that you end up with the creed and the creed is what everyone has to accept as true in order to be an official member of the church, right? And here's some of the things associated. By the way, the word creed is just Latin for credo, which means I believe, right? It's the verb for I believe. When you say the prayer or you say the creed, you start off by saying, Credo in unum Deum, right? I believe in one God, etc. And by the way, there are hundreds of creeds now. Each new sect that develops creates their own creed to indicate where they are different from the other ones, right, etc. So that is always something interesting. Okay. Now, by the way, as I mentioned at the time of St. Augustine, as an orator in Milan, he was a representative of the emperor, and the emperor was a follower of Arius. So just because the council decreed that Arianism was wrong doesn't actually end it. In fact, we have contemporary believers of the Arian heresy. Today, I think I mentioned last class that John Milton was essentially a follower of Arianism in his Paradise Lost, for example. You get the sense that there's a conflict between Jesus and his brother, who is Lucifer, right? So that's kind of interesting. With contemporary sects today, one of our students years ago did his thesis presentation arguing that the Latter-day Saints are a member or a church that essentially espouses the Arian heresy, right, today, right? So it doesn't go away. In fact, I think I mentioned what's his name? He wrote the series of books called His Dark Materials, which are we mentioned that, right? Yeah. That's again another example of that, right? Michael Pullum. Pullum? I used to know it. I'm getting old enough where a lot of the things I used to know I used to know, but now I don't remember, like the name of my wife. No, I remember. She always gives me grief whenever I say honey, because she figures, hey, did you forget my name again? I'm just kidding, I think. But in any case, okay. So.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Before we go too far. So I want to go back to like the translations, and the, so what would you say is the most correct
None.
translation? No?
No. I'm a firm believer in Quine's, Willard Van Orman Quine's thesis that all translation is a lie.
Interpretation?
An interpretation. Quine. Let's see which. So it's referred to as the indeterminacy of translation thesis. A favorite book of mine that really demonstrates this beautifully is Hofstadter's. Am I not typing someplace? I'm totally Hofstadter. Le Tombeau de Maroc. This is a absolutely beautiful book. It's actually in English, despite the French title, and it's about a French poem that he saw. So Douglas Hofstadter saw this. I believe this is actually a picture of what he saw. So it's a cross in a cemetery with a French poem on it that was basically a get well card. Didn't work, obviously, because the person, presumably, that it was written for, died. But Hofstadter decided to translate the poem, and so he made his own translation of it, and he thought, yeah, I'll try another one, and he did another one, and he did another one. I think he did something like 14 of his own versions of it. Then he got the idea of emailing a lot of his friends, about 60 of his friends, and he emailed them and asked them to translate it, and he got all these other translations, and he put them all together in a book. And something I did years ago, I would I would bring paper, that stuff you get from trees, and I would bring it with one of the translations on the one side and the French translation on the other, but I would give it to students with just the English on the top, and have about 5 or 6 of the students read the poem that they got till they were bored, basically. And that's when I would point out, okay, flip it over, and you realize that they're all translations of the same poem, which no one had realized, because they were so different. So, part of the thesis of this book really goes along with Willard Van Orman Quine's thesis, the indeterminacy of translation. In fact, it gets worse, because I'm speaking English, which I presume most of you speak fluently. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But that doesn't matter really, because what we mean by that is we should all be able to understand one another. But what we do know is that everybody comes from different peer groups, with different families, with different meanings associated with different words, even if we are fluent speakers of English. And so a good question might be, what do I mean by meaning? What do I mean when I say something, like, what does this word mean? One of the fun things is whenever I ask someone, okay, language is confusing. What do I mean by that? No one will say, language is confusing. They'll all take a different approach to explaining what that might have meant, right? So then if we go back to a book which, number one, we might not even know for sure is the historical correct book, written by who? And then we end up analyzing that and discovering that we've got other copies, but there are slight differences from different places. How did that happen, right? Which one is correct? And then you have individuals doing translations like this, and you end up, well, which one is the correct? Well, there is none. That's a mistake in thinking that there is one. In a sense, all translation is a lie. It's an art form, right? By the way, we don't get any better when we start thinking about historical events. Bill Clinton, our president at the time, was on trial for having, or maybe not having, sex with one of his interns, Monica Lewinsky. And they asked him, did he have sex with Monica Lewinsky? And his answer famously was, it all depends on what the word is. Yes? Are you familiar with this? You could look it up on YouTube. That's a meme, an internet meme, that you could find him asking that. And that's like a lawyer speak. What do you mean by is? Etc.
So it's kind of like eyewitness accounts, like if two people saw the same thing
They're both
happen.
different, usually.
Yeah.
Right?
They perceive it differently.
So I guess begs the question, why does anybody listen or follow and think that anything that is read about any of those things is reality?
Well, what else are we going to do?
Think about it this way.
And despite
Fair enough.
how I've
Yeah.
approached this, to say that all translation's a lie, the indeterminacy of communication, unless you're a computer, which is,
Very,
very
plain.
exactly
Yeah.
the same. By the way, we could say that one of the reasons we're so depressed about our own ability to be absolutely exact in our communication is because we have computers that do such an incredible job. We're now not capable of being as accurate as devices that we have. You might look at the history of this problem and discover that a little bit changed when they invented carbon paper. That was a significant event because at that point they could have 2 or 3 copies of the same thing, and so that became significant. And before that, of course, you didn't, have true and and you wouldn't have a notary, seal and so on. So what we mean by exactitude is changing, so that adds to it. But when you tie this in, one of the reasons that this whole issue came about was because of this conflict. Which translation, which description of Jesus can we trust? That was one of the things that motivated this whole concern, right? And the pessimism that comes out of it, the quest for the historical Jesus, right, ends up leading you to this pessimistic view that there's no way you can know who Jesus was or what Jesus actually was trying to communicate.
Yeah. I mean, it leads into agnostic beliefs, you could never know because it's a God or some sort of being.
Yeah, or was he just a man?
Yeah.
A lot of people would even argue.
You're wrong.
Well, and
A lot of people would argue that he might not have even existed.
Yeah.
How do we know
Well, it's
he
also
even
ironic,
existed?
because like you said, based on translation, the Arius and Athanasius would be wrong, I guess, in that sense, whereas the man could be the only logical explanation based on the fact that translation can't be exact and can be, a lie, and people can put whatever they want, really. So,
Well, if you go to Bethlehem, which, by the way, I think the argument is really good that he couldn't have really been born in Bethlehem. A lot of the stories, like that he was born in Bethlehem. Well, John Dominic Crossan, one of the members of the Jesus Seminar, points out that at the time of Jesus' birth, the cave in Bethlehem, which is still there, well, although it's got a church on it now, and you have to work your way down, through. And by the way, there's 3 different priests groups that take turns during the week running the shrine, because they settled their conflict with one another this way, so that they each can get some money, from the tourists and everything. But on the church outside, it says in Latin that the Word was made flesh. Right? So Jesus, by being born a man, the Word, which is logos in Greek, right, is the order of the universe, became a man, right? That's kind of cool. I've not been there, by the way, except remember I have an Oculus Rift, and I love taking Google Earth trips all over the place. Latest one, by the way, was to Megiddo, which is a hill, which means Har, Megiddo. And on Har Megiddo they have a tell, which is a castle or fortress, which was destroyed by the Romans. And by the way, that's where we get Armageddon from, right? Har Megiddo, Armageddon. So the story basically is a story about that battle. And when I was hovering, with Google Earth over the site, I noticed just slightly downhill and off a little bit was a McDonald's. So there's a McDonald's in Armageddon now, just so you know.
I'm sorry.
As a separate question from the translation, because I remember hearing about there being the Jeffersonian translation of the Bible where it takes out all the miracles. Would that be something like Robert Jesus Seminar would
Oh,
follow
yes.
more
Oh,
closely,
yes.
or would it be more of
Well,
what we understand?
Thomas Jefferson was an American deist, and American deism believes that there's a creator God, but that's not the kind of God that you can have a personal relationship with. And so Thomas Jefferson absolutely didn't believe Jesus was God, just a wonderful preacher. And yes, he took multiple versions of the Gospels, and he put them together in what's called the Jefferson Bible, which it's on the internet. So
So that would be the one that when they're having their seminars, they're basing most of their ideas off of is what his says and not.
they're not basing their ideas off of Jefferson's specific. He wasn't that good a scholar, actually. He just took what was available to him and lined them up next to one another, but deleted all of the things he didn't believe himself.
Mhm.
So that's what he did. But the folks like in this seminar are incredible scholars, and the books that you could go and look at are incredible detailed studies of the history of the time and everything. One of John Dominic Crossan's books on Jesus of Nazareth, I was on page 600 before he got to the point where he mentioned Jesus arriving. It was up to, I think it was 600 pages. He was talking about life in the Mediterranean. Maybe it was 250. It was a lot of pages. I'll just give you. He's quite impressive. He was a priest. He's no longer a priest. Okay, but let's get to how the church's view of who Jesus was became official dogma. Apart from, yes?
Well, the first reference to Jesus was like 350 years after his supposed birth, wasn't it?
No,
the Romans were basically combining paganism with the Old Testament Orthodox, and the Christianity was kind of a blend of multicultural traditions.
This is pretty clear that Jesus had followers, and they believed in him, and he called men to be his followers, 12, and they left their jobs, they left their families, and they basically believed in him so much, his charisma or what he said was so impressive that they fought, and what he did, right? So they followed him. And once he died, and of course, the issue of the resurrection is an important issue. But they didn't give up. They instead went out on their own and began teaching what their teacher had taught them. And over roughly 30 years, they ended up then writing what they had been teaching. And so those were referred to as the various traditions, right? So you have the Mark tradition, the Matthew tradition, the Luke tradition, the John tradition, and other ones besides. But the Nicene Council decided, along with the Creed, that these are the good books that Christians should read if you want to be a good Christian, right? And so the orthodox, the correct beliefs, right, were decided by this council, right? Yes, so that's 325 AD that they do that. But the books were already there and in circulation, and the question was, which books are the ones we ought to believe in, right? And they condemned some and said, no, these are bad. You shouldn't read these because they'll give you the wrong impression. I mentioned the book of Thomas, or the Gospel of Thomas. Which is on the web. It had been condemned, and only scraps of it had continued in circulation all those years. But in 1949, 1845, some boys were digging in the dirt across the Nile from where they lived, looking for lime for their garden, and they hit a urn, which they discovered a whole bunch of old books in. One of the men from the village knew that these were valuable, so rescued them from, they were going to use them to cook and other things, but they rescued this Nag Hammadi library, and in the collection was an entire book of Thomas. So since that time, we've had the entire book of Thomas, which is the sayings gospel. So it doesn't have any of the life story of Jesus. It instead just has, he said this, he said this, he said, right, sayings, And there's a lot more sayings than a lot of the other ones, but there is overlap, right? Now, remember, it's Gnostic, so some of the sayings are a bit outside of the norm for the Orthodox set of beliefs, right? And by the way, Thomas, of course, would have been one of the apostles. So notice this very well could be a tradition from the apostles themselves. Where was I going to go with that? You had a question that I can't remember now. Where did I answer the question?
Kind of. You're asking about the Nicene Convention. What led to
Right.
Christianity.
They decided which books were the ones that were the good ones, right? The other books sometimes are included still, and you can actually find, I guess there are hundreds, right, of them. And they're referred to as apocrypha, or false writings, right? But like, one of the official versions of the Bible that the Catholic Church puts out says, it's, the official version of the Bible with apocrypha. So you actually get some other writings that, are popular even though they don't officially approve of them. But you can still get them. But there's like Secret James, Secret Mary, Mary Magdalene, right? There's Pilate has his own gospel out there, he was the head of the Roman state at the time. Of course he would write his own version of all of, no, who believes that, right? But somebody wrote it, and it was old enough that it got circulated, and people believe, hey, I've got, Pilate's version of it, right?
It's like having the devil's version. You can burn that.
The Kindle edition. There you go. Good reads. The Acts of Pilate. Fake news, maybe. Who thinks fake news is a relatively new thing? No, we've always had fake news, I suppose. Okay, so Augustine. How does Augustine actually succeed in persuading everyone to, well, not everyone, but the majority, to accept a particular view of who Jesus was? Is that camera still going? It is. How about that? So for one thing, we know about Augustine's life that his mother was a Catholic and his father was not, a pagan. But all her life, his mother wanted him to become a Catholic. He himself and his mother would pray that he becomes a Catholic, but not too soon. And this is kind of a famous quote as well, because he wanted to make sure that he had a lot of time to have all the sins that a normal person would have, right? It was his understanding, his mother's understanding, that he's a young man, he's going to want to sin, you know, and baptism washes away your sins completely. So wait until you get all the sinning done and then get baptized, and then they'll all be, you know, cleaned off your slate, right? You know, so that's kind of famous. But that's actually what he does. He initially, as a young man, becomes a student of oratory in Carthage, and then eventually moves to Milan and becomes a rhetor. Meanwhile, he becomes a member of a quasi-Christian sect called the Manichaeans. You ever heard of them? They're, in a sense, another version of the Arian sect, the Manichaeans. They're followers of Mani. Notice it's dualistic. So the thing about this religion was that you have both good and evil fighting one another as part of their understanding of the nature of the universe, right? So that's Persian, but through Mani was a Christian, but his interpretation of Jesus, for example, was that Jesus was a brother of Lucifer, which that's why I think, you know, I've heard that the Latter-day Saints believe that too. If you're anybody from the the Church of Latter-day Saints, I still screwed it up. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's the official. Yes. No
My
one
mom
else.
is, and so is her side of the family. It's actually kind of like, I don't know, we have trouble within our families because of it, you know, because my parents split apart. So it's like I've got one human saying go this way, and then the other human says go this way, you know.
Well, the interesting thing is, if you look up a volume about the history of American religions, the Latter-day Saints, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the Shakers are referred to as the Millerite religions, because they were inspired by William Miller, who was a preacher in like New York and Pennsylvania, and what's referred to as the burned over district. Have you ever heard of it?
Mm-mm. I just let her be.
The burned over district. Because they've had so many revivals that the district has been burned over. That makes sense. But William Miller believed that he figured out exactly when the second coming was going to be. I should just look him up, I suppose.
Have you seen the
Probably
Left
the past
Behind
one.
movies?
What did I do?
What is it? Oh, you first.
Oh, no, I was saying he predicted the second coming, but I'm sure it's probably in the past now.
They stood out in the field waiting, because they figured they knew exactly what day at what time
Yeah,
it would be. But guess what? It didn't happen, actually. So that's kind of interesting. But Joseph Smith's,
That just become a letdown.
yeah, but they,
guys, it's like, you know, fishing.
but
The
they,
fish never bites.
they did not conclude that he was wrong about that it was coming. They figured he was wrong about the specific date. So they went back to the drawing board and figured out another date and so on. But Joseph Smith's father took him to William Miller's preaching, and so the argument in the text is that that was one of the other religions that were inspired by these are the latter days, right? You know, so Jesus is due, you know, should, you know, figure it out, you know, and it was going to be in New York, you know, that's, you know, especially, he wouldn't even have a green card, just showing up. You know,
Have you seen the Left Behind movies?
That's,
no, I have not.
that's what you said.
Yeah. That's right.
My wife has all the books though, I think of,
Give
those
them a
are the.
watch. Give them a watch one day.
The
And there's
movies
this-
are
There's this,
a little over the top, but.
yeah.
Well, in any case,
They are.
now how did I get onto that? These are all squirrels, I guess. Because the real star here is Augustine. Because Augustine is going to eventually be converted by Bishop Ambrose. And I have, really, we should look at Bishop Ambrose. Who was the Bishop of Milan, and was the one that converted Augustine. And there's a terrific book called The Font of Life. It reads, it was it's relatively recent. Gary Wills writes a lot of stuff. But I mean, he writes about like Abraham Lincoln and, he's all over the place. But it's a really good book, and it's about them just recently archaeologically digging up the fountain or the baptismal font where Augustine would have been baptized in Milan by Ambrose. So it's just been recently dug up, and that's what's inspired him to write the book about the relationship between the two. But in any case, he becomes a Catholic Christian, and then heads back to North Africa, where he plans on just living as a monk, maybe. But because he is so educated and the community needs priests, they encourage him to become an active priest for the church. Within a few years, he becomes the bishop, because the bishop had died, and so he becomes the next bishop. And so the whole rest of his life then, he's a bishop, and he's not only preaching for his community in Hippo, but he's also writing responses to other theologians like Jerome, and in response to the Donatists, which was another sect. By the way, if you watch that movie that I pointed out, there's a great section on that. It's really kind of impressive piece. But the Pelagian, so there's like 2 or 3 different major heresies that he's still actively arguing with. And he wins, basically. He's the one that becomes really the dominant point of view. And so his books are what essentially lay the foundations for the dogma of the church. It's in league, it's based on the decision of the Nicene Council. And then you have Platonic philosophy. And when you think about let's see here. When you think about why philosophy is important, he points out that most Christians don't really need to know metaphysics because they're busy. And it reminds me of when I was a kid and so on. I just heard the stories that the priests told me, and it was made for children, basically. It was, as you get older and you start having questions about those things, you wonder, how the heck is this possible, right? And you need to have more sophisticated answers as you get older. Of course, a lot of people don't need that. You know, it's a relatively new thing that we have a literate population, right? If you think about the Middle Ages, you know, that was, a lot of monks were not literate. It wasn't everyone that even, as a priest would have a chance to read the gospel and things of that sort, right? But today it's quite a lot different, of course, because we all expect to have basic education, and one of the things we get, of course, is science and math, and you put 2 and 2 together and you start asking things like, well, how does Jesus exist both as man and as God, right? And if you look at the creed here, so that this is the Nicene Creed. I believe in one God in English, right? The Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. What does that mean? Visible and invisible.
Fact that they-
Meta matter.
This is Platonic philosophy. Remember, Plato argues that you have matter, and the ideas, right? Remember, the ideas, the good, greatest idea that basically emanates all the other ideas, which then structures the universe, right? These are invisible, abstract, have no substance, right? Aristotle would argue you can't actually have anything if it doesn't have substance. They don't really exist. But Plato, remember, is the one that wins. And Augustine is a Platonist. He is familiar with some of Aristotle's works. In fact, in the one book, Augustine is literally dealing with Aristotle's predicaments. And when you look at what the predicaments are, that's just the Latin or the English translation of the Latin version of the categories, right? And so he's literally trying to deal with, as a young man in his 20s, with Aristotle's work describing the categories, right? So he's familiar with Aristotle, but he goes with Plato and argues that there's the visible and the invisible, right? That's, the council is Platonic, right? So what we have is this merger of a Jewish prophet and Athenian, or Athens, right? So Jerusalem and Athens, what's the connection between Jerusalem and Athens? That's kind of a famous relationship, right? Because Christianity is a Jewish sect, but it has Greek philosophical elements, right? So that's seemingly where the difference comes, right? And of course you have the fall. How do you explain the fall? By the way, when people go to seminary today still and study how to become a good preacher, most of the sermons that they study are St. Augustine's. He's got sermons on all sorts of things. And so basically, a typical sermon is someone reading St. Augustine's version of it and updating it to fit their own, church, right? But the fall, how many people are familiar with the fall? What the fall is? This is Adam and Eve, right, in the garden. And famously, they were told not to eat the fruit of that tree. By the way, how many folks think it's an apple? Nobody's familiar with the story? Yes? Well, I'll obviously it wasn't an apple, because if it was in the Middle East, they don't grow apples there, right? So probably not, right? But clearly a Western European idea is they have apples, so what fruit would it be? So the typical thinking is that it's an apple, right? But obviously not, right? But the tree is a dangerous tree, because if you eat the fruit of this tree, this is in Genesis, right? Then you will know good and evil. This is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat this fruit, you will know the difference between good and evil, and you will die, right? This is bad. Don't eat that. You'll learn about the difference between good and evil. Knowledge of good and evil. Well, of course, we know actually from Eve's diary. Did you know we had a copy of Eve's diary?
I didn't know Eve can write.
Yeah, I think she must have invented it, right? It was found by an archaeologist named Mark Twain. It's one of my favorites. She even has a cover. See?
I think you showed us this when I asked about, I think what is it,
It's
the
hilarious.
spouse or whatever, I forgot what it was.
If you read this, make sure you wear one of those like wrestling belts, so that you don't get a split gut, while you're laughing so hard. It's absolutely hilarious. In fact, the whole book, these are posthumous publications of Mark Twain. He was scared to death of actually publishing this stuff while he was alive. So it came out afterwards. But it is absolutely hilarious. In any case, according to Eve, they never ate the fruit. And that explains why we still don't know the difference. But unfortunately, God thought that they had, and so he kicked them out of the garden anyway. But that's Eve's diary, right? But obviously, in tradition, they did eat the fruit. And Adam basically blamed it on her. The woman you gave me that to eat. That's not my fault. It's your fault, God.
Sounds pretty evil.
Didn't I say that the female issues?
I don't know why I'm looking at you and I'm
And,
blaming it on. Sorry. I didn't mean.
Painful pregnancy was the punishment from God for her eating the apple, which leads to the patriarchal society rather than matriarchal. And the
Well,
interpretation of it.
I don't remember I'm actually quoting Augustine with that bit about Adam blaming it on Eve, who, by the way, God gave him, right? So he's actually blaming it on. Augustine has this wonderful bit about when he's a child, and they went out and they stole the pears from a pear tree, a neighbor's pear tree, that the neighbor really loved, and they weren't even good pears. And they didn't even eat the pears. They gave them to the pigs. So why did they steal them? Just for fun. They did evil things just for fun. And this becomes a theological concern of his, even, of course, as a bishop. Although, remember, he's writing the Confessions as a bishop, looking back over his life and describing his life as leading up to his becoming a bishop. So I think if you were the kid writing about stealing the pears, you'd probably have a totally different take on why you stole the pears, right? But so he's very concerned about guilt, very concerned about why Adam wouldn't recognize that the reason he was guilty of eating the fruit was his own choice. Because we have free will. And instead, he's not recognizing that. He's blaming it on Eve. Oh, and you gave her to me, right? So it's like not even, my fault at all, right? And Augustine doesn't like that at all, right? Because we should recognize our own choice, right, etc. But what happens at the fall is because we've eaten the fruit, we now know the difference between good and evil. We wouldn't have known it before. This is the reason we've fallen, because now we recognize good and evil. And if you think about it, part of the questions that people would have on God, if he is all-powerful, thought I had, yeah, right here. If God is all-powerful and he's all good, why has he created evil in the world? Right? Augustine's answer is that God did not create evil. Think about it. A tree is a tree. It's neither good nor evil, except it's in nature. Nature is, if you think of all nature is good.
Created by God.
Right? Right? But when I look at the tree, I think, oh, it's a lovely tree, it's good, it gives me wonderful shade in our hot, miserable summers. Here. But my neighbors are absolutely horrified about this tree because it's a cottonwood, and every summer it blossoms with all this cotton that blows all over, and they're, by the way, allergic to this cotton. And so they get sick for weeks at a time, and it's all because of this tree, this evil tree, right? And I love the tree because I'm, into global warming as a thing, and I love global warming to slow down, so I know growing trees is supposed to help, right? And this is the biggest tree in my yard, etc. But my neighbors think it's evil, so I cut it down. So I keep my neighbors happy, right? So what we have is something that in nature is neither good nor evil, but appears to be good to me and evil to them. And the reason that we do this is because we have fallen, and we have our own perspectives about what's good and evil. God didn't create good and evil. The tree is a tree. But it appears to be good to some people and evil to others. Now granted, here's the problem, and C.S. Lewis really has a problem with this. The problem of pain, the problem of evil. How do you account for things where no one disagrees that it's evil? The coronavirus that people seem to be getting, even though they haven't had any coronas, right? I don't think they even sell coronas in China, and yet that's where it got started, right? By the way, Dos Equis is much better.
Dos Equis virus.
Yes. I'm just kidding.
Better than the Bud Light virus.
I don't drink either of them, actually. I don't think. However, that was humor thrown in. Right? Okay. But, yeah, everyone was supposed to laugh, but no one did. That's really, never use that joke ever again. Okay, so the reason that there's evil in the world for Augustine is because we see it. We see good, we see evil. And by the way, this is now passed on to the next generations. It's the original sin that every human being has, because as you grow up as a human being in a family, you're going to feel good and bad as well. You're infected with the same thing. If you notice, animals, they apparently don't have this problem. They don't think of good and evil existing in the world. They just live, right? When we were part of the state of nature, we probably would have lived just like that too. But we're separate now from the other animals because we see good and evil, and it bothers us, and we wonder, why is God all good and all powerful, and yet has given us so much evil in the world? We have to realize that it's not God that did it, it's our fault. It's our seeing evil in the world that brings it about. Granted, we might all get sick and die, but that's just part of nature.
It's not evil at all.
It's not evil,
It's totally
normal. But we feel like it's evil, and that God has obviously not done what he could have done by making, or she, to make life absolutely wonderful, right? And a lot of people will critique God for this. When Augustine, way back in 420 or whatever, is basically explaining that it's not God's fault, it's the fault. We have become aware of good and evil, pass this on to our children, so all humans are basically infected. How can we be rescued from this infection? Well, Jesus is born, and he is God, says Augustine, right? And in one Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God and born of the Father, before all ages. So supposedly he's, we would say born in Nazareth, but maybe born in Bethlehem, roughly around 0 AD, which is where we get that as a discriminating point in our BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, right? We're assuming that's roughly when Jesus was born. Actually, it couldn't be 0, because the church screwed up and said that it was 1 BC and then 1 AD, so they skipped the obvious year that had to be there. So that the math was bad, right? John Dominic Crossan, I mention him a lot, but he argues that perhaps Jesus was born around 3 AD or thereabouts, right? By the way, there was no time when the Romans or Herod basically had all of the children destroyed to make sure that they killed him. They never did that. They wouldn't have had a sense